Okay, so these are causes of the Korean War from Miss Richardson and Mr. Culhane's U.S. history class. We're going to look at kind of what built up to the Korean War. Then in class, we'll look at the progression during the Korean War. And then your second set of notes, 4.4, will be about the results of the Korean War. So let's go ahead right now and look at these causes of the Korean War and what was happening. Well, first we have to think about what was happening at the end of World War II. And we have to think about kind of what happened there and what we've been talking about in class at the beginning of the Cold War, that lots of the world was seeing change. We had a lot of these changes we're seeing between the US and the Soviet Union. We see all this tension that's really showing up in Europe that we've already talked about in class. But also remember, the US and the Soviet Union both had influences in Asia during World War II. So when the war is ending, or the war ends, and both the Soviets and the US are helping in Asia, we're going to see tension in Asia as well. So some things to remember as we go through and look at this. Let me go ahead and pull up the highlighter here for you. So end of World War II, tensions in Europe. We're looking at the Soviets and the US, and this is going to end up going into the rest of the world. So here we see a cartoon that kind of shows the tensions between the US. And remember, we talked about before the US, we've got Uncle Sam, but I said before, the Soviet Union is often shown as the bear, and they're kind of balancing who gets what in the world. So you can kind of see that idea in this cartoon. Or here, where over here in Europe, we know that there was a lot of tension because we've got the Soviet Union here. Again, I can go back to my highlighter. So here's our Soviet Union, all of this giant place. And then if we look a little bit further, we're going to be talking about China a little bit, not too long from now. So as we're looking at that, you can see where that is. And then Korea right there. So you can see why Asia matters to the Soviet Union. And all of the other tensions we're seeing are happening over here in Europe. So that spreads out, and part of the reason that spreads out is Japan. So Japan, if we think back about the war and how it ended, Japan was a major foe of the United States in World War II. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We were very angry. We dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. So we know how the war ended. So Japan loses. The US absolutely defeated them. So the US actually takes over Japan. We basically occupy Japan. We create military bases in Japan, and we put General Douglas MacArthur in charge of the country, essentially as a dictator, and he rebuilds Japan. So the US government gets to determine who rebuilds Japan and what that will look like. Very different than a lot of other places. So the US put bases here, and then we've got all these areas, which include, as we said before, do this one in the pen, areas that Japan took over, which include Korea. So we have all these places that Japan has had influence and took over, and we've got to decide what do we do with that after the war. And that's really where Korea is coming in. So Japan had gone and taken them over. They had been under Japanese control. But now, if we look at this map of Okinawa, the island of Okinawa in Japan, you can see all these areas where the US military is. So US military bases are where the orange is. And this happens all through Japan. We have US control. So although Japan was controlling all kinds of places during the war, after the war, the US takes over Japan, and we have to determine what to do with those places that Japan used to control. And the man in charge of this guy right here, General MacArthur. So this is General MacArthur. His name is on your vocab sheet. That didn't circle him very well, did it? We'll make him yellow. Still, you can't see it very well on green or black. But General MacArthur is the man who is in charge of Japan and really makes the decisions for Japan. Now we need to look at China. As we look at China, we have to think about our map and kind of go back to that idea We pull our map back up for a second. Remember, China's right here. We got Soviet Union. The US believes in that whole policy of containment. So you kind of remember that we believe in containment. So we don't want China or communism to spread. But the Chinese communists actually fight the Chinese government to control the country. This happens in 1949. So it's in the 40s, but post. So the Chinese communists, they're very upset about the Chinese government. They're upset about the war. They don't like their government anymore. So Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Chinese communists, leads them in a fight, a revolution against the Chinese government that was in place at the time, and overthrows the existing Chinese government in 1949, which means that China really does become communist. So we fail at containment. The United States is going to aid the Chinese government because we want to resist the communists. That policy is the policy I just mentioned, containment. I don't know if I can write on here. Ooh, look at me. Not writing very well. So we want to contain communism. So containment is the policy. So this becomes interesting because the Chinese government actually goes to Taiwan. So they flee to Taiwan. They set up a new Chinese government, or the existing Chinese government, in Taiwan and maintain their seats in the United Nations. So Mao Zedong, his government is in charge of China, and they are communist. But they do not sit in the United Nations. They have no international pull. The reason for this, from the U.S. standpoint, and this right here is Mao Zedong at the Cultural Revolution, his little red book, all happens to be with Communist China. You hopefully will learn a little bit more about that in world history. But the reason for this whole thing with the United Nations is the Security Council. So if you remember, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Any one of those 5 has veto power. The US, France, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is already communist. If we have communist China there too, we're starting to lose power in the United Nations. So the U.S. actually keeps the government who has been exiled to Taiwan that has no actual control over China as the members of the United Nations, so they have one more ally in the United Nations. So now we get to Korea. So the Koreans in Korea wanted independence, so wanted it to be restored. So where it says Koreans hope their country would be restored, they wanted an independent Korea after World War II. The Japanese had surrendered, war is over, the Japanese have to give up their holdings, Korea is assuming they will gain independence. Instead, the Soviets get the northern half, the US gets the southern half. We make it into 2 zones. The 38th parallel is where we divide Korea. So Korea ends up divided up, half and half, and the 2 major powers who were going to help in Asia, the US and the Soviet Union, split this area. US in the south, Soviets in the north. So think about that for a minute. So if we look at the map here, this is exactly how it is. So we've got China that is communist in the north, North Korea that the Soviets control, and South Korea that the US controls. And they are divided right here by the 38th parallel, this line that goes right through. Now, if you think about the tensions between the countries, you can literally see we've got communism above and we've got capitalism below, and you can see where the problems are going to come. Where else did we divide up like this after the war? Hopefully you remember it was Germany. So Germany and Berlin, and we also see problems with that. So both, it says armies of occupation, both the US and the Soviets had military force in Korea until 1949. So both kept their military there and helped them rebuild. So the US had their pro-US capitalist democratic government in the South, and the communist government in North Korea. But remember, the Koreans all want to be one country, so that's where our problem really comes in. They're not happy being separated. So as we go through, you've got your 38th parallel. The two countries are not happy being separated, and they want to be one country. But we have two very different ideologies in the two halves. So in class, we're going to actually talk about the war and how the war breaks out, which is really about, for the Koreans in the war, reuniting the country into one country. For the US, it's about containment, and for the Soviet Union, it's about protecting China. And for China, it's about protecting China. So we'll look at that in class. We'll actually draw the Korean War onto maps, and we'll add some captions and info to that as we go. So make sure that you understand this, you bring any questions to class, and I will see you in class tomorrow.